You're listening to Bible Truth Feed, a podcast by christadelphianvideo.org for Christadelphians and all those seeking the truth about the Bible message. Join us now as we present our latest episode.
Beside the Brook, Chapter 12, Fire in the Wood. The afternoon was hazy and hot, and in the stillness of the woods the only sounds were the crackling of opening cones and the soft cooing of pigeons. The silence of summer had come to the other birds, for the raising of 2 or 3 broods had made them forget their spring songs, and the younger birds could not yet sing. Another wryneck twisted its snaky neck from the hole in the tree where Peggy and John had seen the first. Mr. Jupe contemplated moving his pheasants any night now to the freedom of the woods, for July had come, and the young charges were long-legged and plump with stiff quills well grown. Tall green bracken now fringed the tracks in the big cover, and except for purple clumps of heather, the woods were too shaded to permit the growth of any flower except the hardiest weeds. As the day wore on, the shafts of sunlight streaming between the trees grew grey with an unnatural haze, and a smell of smoke drifted through the wood. It was not the mild and pleasant fragrance of a woodman's fire, but an odour that grew stronger minute by minute. The workers in the timber yard, getting ready to close the sawmill for the day, became aware of the signs. "There is a forest somewhere," said the foreman. "The smoke is coming from the big cover," exclaimed Bob Tyler, running for his bicycle. "There would be a fire just on knocking off time," groused old Harry Pitt. "Suppose we'll be expected to go and put un out." "'Tis the least we can do," reproved the foreman. "It'll spread like fury in this dry weather, and there's no saying where it'll stop." He led the way to the woods, from the densest part of which a cloud of smoke billowed into the pale sky, and before that had dispersed, another ashen blue rolled swiftly up against it. "It's got a good hold!" shouted Bob, as he raced along the soil track through the woods. "'Twere lucky for me I never shifted me birds," observed Mr. Jupe, standing hands on hips to gaze at the smoke column. "'Tis getting thick. Hope they'll stop afore it gets here." He had seen many fires, so he did not take this one too badly. Once or twice his own cottage buried in the woods had been threatened. The centre of this fire was a good distance from that, so he resumed his work of feeding grain to his charges. Kenneth, on his way home from work, saw the fire and went a mile or so out of his way to lend what aid he could. It was a simple matter for him to locate the fire, for apart from the cries of men there arose a thick and rapid crackling as of the splitting of brittle sticks, and on the air, choked with suffocating brown smoke, floated flakes of wood ash and sparks. Throwing his bicycle into a bush, he ran along a tunnel in the undergrowth that opened on to a terrifying scene. An acre of peat and heather was asmoke, and from it tongues of flame licked up the boles of tall Scots firs, as if reaching to pull their stately tops to destruction. Bushes disappeared in a moment of fierce crackling. Neat stacks of fir props, the result of hours of work by the foresters, were attacked and consumed in fiery ferocity, the resinous sap feeding the hungry flames. Fire leapt from bole to bole, sweeping towards the fresh green of silver birches, which shrivelled as if recoiling from the blaze. Clumps of sphagnum moss, grown to the size of armchair cushions in the boggy soil of winter, now afforded dry fuel for the flames racing along the ground. Men homebound to the villages near had rallied to the combat. Though hungry and tired after the day's work, they fell to beating the ground with branches hastily cut from the birches. They did not attempt to extinguish the flames attacking woodpiles and trees. That would have been a fruitless task. But they beat the smoking ground wherever a red glow blossomed into a fountain of sparks, to prevent the fire from travelling along to the dense part of the woods. Foresters hewed clearings to check the course of the flames, as if possessed of their morning strength. "Fire engine'll soon be here," called the timber yard foreman. "Hey, Bob's on the high road to show them the quickest way." Kenneth had cut a switch from a tree, and standing in line with 3 others was beating the ground furiously. This was no time to put his thought into words, for he wanted all his strength and breath, but he noticed the adders and grass snakes sliding between the heather clumps to the shadow of the dark woods, and the beetles and spiders tumbling in haste to get away. Suddenly he heard a guttural scow-wowing behind him, and caught sight of a frenzied red squirrel, legs outspread and sensitive tail a-quiver. All ways she looked, now springing to the right, now to the left, now facing the blaze, now retreating from it. Fear of the racing red destruction had caused her wits to forsake her. It was greater than the fear of men, to whom she now fled in her extremity. But no one had time for squirrels. The wild things must look after themselves. 2 engines had arrived, and the hoses wound like black serpents through the woods to the Trout Brook and its tributaries. Though the waters were at a low level, the pools were always deep, and soon the steady throb of the engines added their reassurance to the uncertain striving of men. A face wearing blue spectacles appeared at the tunnel, proclaiming the owner to be Mr. Sprackling, diverted from his journey home by desire to see the excitement. He did not offer to help, for he was a bit lame in one leg. An old man might provide more trouble than help in this fight by the nimble of limb. Besides, Snowball's rein was hitched to a tree, and he did not guarantee what might happen if Queenie's eagerness to get home were thwarted. Limping towards the beaters, he accosted them. "That be hotter nor hell, bain't it?" he remarked sympathetically. The men were too engrossed to reply, and scarcely noticed him, though Kenneth marked the observation. "I'll tell you later," he replied, without stopping his exertions. And Mr. Sprackling departed. Some wives, guessing the reason for the non-arrival of their menfolk, had come with tea in baskets and watched from a safe distance, waiting until the fire came under sufficient control for the firefighters to pause. The steady sprays from the roses seemed to quench the fire at last. Like an orange between the treetops, the sun cast bars of brown light through the smoke cloud upon tree trunks shining and black, and upon masses of charcoal. The woodland was now only smoking sullenly, and the men could ease off to recover strength, their faces black, their bodies sweating. Now and again a fighter ran to beat out a flame that surged up from the smouldering peat to lick round a heather clump. "Reckon some of us could go home now," said Bob. "Aye, it's been a long day," said another. The head forester was now arranging a system of night watches, for the fire would smother for the day or 2. "I'll look in on Teddy for a cup of tea and a wash," thought Kenneth, not relishing the prospect of an hour's cycle ride before reaching home. Teddy gave him the usual welcome. "So you've been helping to fight the fire," he said. "I watched the smoke and guessed there was a considerable blaze. Did it do much damage?" "A fair amount," replied Kenneth, "but it would have been disastrous had it reached the thickets of the big cover." Mr. Sprackling looked in, and, remembering the mark, he added, "I must do a bit of explaining to him sometime." "Why?" asked Teddy, coaxing the flames below the kettle. "He spoke of the fire being as hot as hell. What a lot of confusion and superstition hangs over the minds of people with regard to matters of heaven and hell. I believe even those who fear God at all think this earth is going to be destroyed by fire in the end, all due to faulty interpretation of the Scriptures," agreed Teddy. "Yes, the word pictures of the book of Revelation and the fires of the rubbish pit outside Jerusalem, and the parable of the rich man and Lazarus are all mixed up to support the idea. People do not distinguish between the real and the pictorial meaning." "I could not do that myself," admitted the shepherd, "without help. I did not understand how the world was to be cleansed at the coming of the Lord." "Yes, the day will come that will burn as an oven," said Kenneth. "I couldn't help thinking as I saw the snakes wriggling from the fire of those words of John the Baptist when he attacked the Pharisees. 'O generation of vipers, who hath warned you to flee from the wrath to come? Now also the axe is laid to the root of the tree. Therefore every tree that bringeth not forth good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire.'" "No, snakes don't like fire," said Teddy. "Didn't one escape from the fire and fasten on Paul's hand after the shipwreck?" "Right," replied Kenneth. "And though a poisonous type, it did the apostle no harm. The power of wickedness cannot hurt the chosen of God in the day of his vengeance." Beside the Brook, Chapter 13. Queenie wants her own way. Hazel the duck did not improve in spite of Teddy's careful nursing. While her three sisters waddled away happily every morning down the track to the brook, she just sat in her box and moped. Teddy sometimes turned her out in a sunny patch, but she did not move far. She became quite tame, and always managed to quack a little greeting when he appeared. To vary her outlook, he carried her to the farm when he fetched the milk, and Hazel enjoyed the ride inside his jacket with her head poking out. The three healthy birds took no notice of her, for wild things either ignore or persecute a sufferer among them. There is no love for the victim unless it be between mother and child. Within a month Hazel died, and the shepherd hid the fact from the children until they had grown used to her absence. The summer grasses were dry and yellow, and the forest roof had turned from the transparency of early summer to a darker green. The earth was full of beauty that changed as the sun passed across the sky. The daily reading of his Bible provided food for the shepherd's mind, and filled him with great joy. He was no crabbed old age, for now he felt he was beginning to live. Would that I had discovered the truth before, was his regret, for he remembered the words, "Those that seek me early shall find me." Finding him is a lifelong quest, but if it please God, I shall not be too late, he thought. Kenneth Summers was a regular visitor at the shieling, and together the old and the young discussed those things that matter most in life. "I cannot understand," observed Kenneth once, "how people can deceive themselves so. They live as if they never had to give an account, yet everyone knows he must die. Perhaps it is that knowing this they try to forget it in a mad round of pleasure-seeking and noise. But it is all the same that these are the latter days," Teddy reminded him, "for it is written, men shall be lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God." "Yes, and having a form of godliness, but denying the power thereof," added Kenneth. "This is truly evident today. There is the form, but not the sincerity." "And God's blessing are put to a wrong use," said Teddy. "Though we are blessed with more advantages than our forefathers, faith is more difficult to find amongst us. That is another sign that these are the last days. The prophet Daniel says, 'Seal the book even to the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased.'" Kenneth looked up as he spoke at a white airliner shining against the blue sky. "That's on its way to Australia, I expect," he said. "They go there from this aerodrome." "I hope I will soon be ready," said the shepherd. "I feel almost sure you will," replied the young man. Leaving the shepherd's home one evening, Kenneth cycled through the village, and in doing so spied Mr. Sprackling busy in a small patch of ground lent him for a garden. "And how are you, Mr. Sprackling?" called he cheerily. The timberman stopped digging and walked stiffly. "Not so bad," he said. "Can't grumble. The one leg be a bit stiff still." "With rheumatism?" inquired Kenneth, noticing that he stroked his thigh with his hand. "No, that were the leg I had it in. No, 'twere that there Queenie," he said, nodding in the direction of the field where the horses were grazing out of sight. "Oh, she's been up to her tricks again, has she?" smiled Kenneth, who had not forgotten Queenie's character while at Exley. "She be a fair devil at times," groused Mr. Sprackling, who nevertheless was proud of his horses. "Snowball be all right, but Queenie be artful. Yeah, artful." "What was her latest prank?" asked Kenneth, trying not to appear amused. "Well," began Mr. Sprackling, settling one foot on the spade and folding his arms on the handle. "'Twere when we were carting furs from the big cover a fortnight or so ago. Timber yard wouldn't hold no more, so we has to pile up logs in park alongside," he continued, mixing his grammar into a fine hotchpotch. "Now Queenie didn't like this. She'm fond o' gwinning the timber yard. I dunno why, less it be from habit. And she feels more at home there, and she got troublesome. Not with us," continued Mr. Sprackling, striving to be accurate in every detail. "'Twere second load. 'Twere round about dinner time. Snowball were in front, and a good thing she were." Then Mr. Sprackling placed his spade on the ground in preparation for going through all the actions. "Now, s'posing that were the load over there, and these here were the posties I had for rolling the logs down, see?" Kenneth nodded. "Well, I undoes the horses from shafties, links their chains round logs, and when all be ready, I hollers, 'Pull it, bossa!' Snowball there, she pulled wi' all her strength, but I'll be blowed if that black oss would pull out, so nothing happened. "Pull her, posse!" I hollers again, and Mr. Sprackling contracted the muscles of his own arms in vivid recollection. And nothing happened again. I hollered at Queenie, but 'twasn't any use. She were in a very wicked frame of mind. But logs had to come off timber cart anyway, so we tried again, and poor Snowball was straining and shining with sweat, while that black devil just stuck up and did nowt. Then I gets cross and gives her a whack with me belt. Snowball thinks I be cross with she, and gives a gurt heave, which brings top log rolling down on hind legs of Queenie, which served her right. But more than that, Queenie gets bowled over with logs striking her back legs, and I gets this here leg struck when too. And that silly oss lying there with her legs up in air as if she couldn't get up, and t'other one looking around concerned about what she'd been and done. Not that I warn't concerned myself. I didn't know but what she had done summat, for she wouldn't get up. So I unharnessed Snowball and let her bide. She'm a good oss. And I spoke very kindly to Queenie to coax her up, but blowed if she'd move, not even to roll sideways, and log wasn't touching her either. Then all those stupid folk from yard came and gathered round, telling me to do this and that. One stoop was talking about sending for vet, but I soon shut he up. I knows my osses better than any vet. So I carried on speaking very kindly to Queenie. "Good lass," I says, clapping her here and there. "Now do he get up like a good oss." 'Tweren't no good, so I tried somebody else. Fixed on Snowball's nose bag and went on for Queenie's. That did it. Her waved her legs only once. Then up she got without any trouble and shook herself, just like that. Words failed Mr. Sprackling at the recollection. Yes, and she were all right, and had been all long, and me with a grazed leg and all those stupid devils from the yard laughing at me, and that black un too, because I swear she were. Mr. Sprackling mopped his brow. It was certainly too bad, agreed Kenneth. And was your leg much hurt? Only bruised and grazed, said the timberman, stroking it. He'll come all right again soon. You had several devils present, said Kenneth solemnly. Mr. Sprackling looked up quickly, wondering if the young man were laughing at him, but remembering the earnestness of their last conversation, he altered his mind. What do he mean? Those devils in the story, said Kenneth. How many were there? Mr. Sprackling avoided a direct reply. Devil was a common word in his collection, and he used it freely and frequently of any living thing that happened to annoy him. Now don't he start, cautioned he, stooping to pick up his spade. But Kenneth was not to be put off. I'm serious, Mr. Sprackling, he said. I do not want to know what you mean by the devil. Is he one? Or is he a number? Mr. Sprackling scratched the back of his head, which tipped his hat forward towards his blue spectacles. Blowed if I know exactly, he confessed. Ain't he a critter as plagues human folk till they does summat wrong? He enquired as if suddenly inspired with an idea. That was closely followed by the remembrance of an awful picture from Pilgrim's Progress Illustrated, which enlivened his youth. Ain't he got leather wings and horns and a forked tail? And don't he live in hell? Kenneth did not laugh. Come and sit down for 5 minutes, Mr. Sprackling, said Kenneth, motioning him to a wheelbarrow. You might as well rest yourself while you can. The timberman sat heavily down. The barrow was weighted with rubbish so that it was quite safe. A robin perched on the spade which Mr. Sprackling had struck in the ground. "Your ideas about the devil are all confused like everybody else's, Mr. Sprackling. I hope you will pardon me for saying so. It's not your fault, but just the result of careless and wrong teaching. Do you mean anyone in particular, your horse, for instance, or the yard men, or do you mean the chap with the horns?" "I don't know what I mean, now I comes to think on it," said Mr. Sprackling. "Do he know any more nor I do, then?" "Well, I have been fortunate enough to have been brought up on Bible teaching, and the Bible settles the matter." Mr. Sprackling felt this was so. "Bain't he in the Bible, then?" For reply, Kenneth went on, "The devil is not a person at all, but the power of sin as it appears in people. There is no personal devil to tempt us to do wrong. Every man is tempted when he's drawn away of his own desires and enticed." Mr. Sprackling was interested, though still doubtful. "Ain't his other name Satan?" he asked. "That is a Hebrew word that was kept in the English translation of the Bible. It sounds like a person's name, but its meaning is adversary." "Oh," said Mr. Sprackling, not sure if he followed. "The devil is the sin power in human beings," continued Kenneth. "Jesus overcame it, and by the sacrifice of his sinless self condemned it. If we make ourselves part of him, then sin can become dead in us. We can become new creatures in him." "And where be hell?" inquired Mr. Sprackling. "I thought the devil he lived there." "As a matter of fact, you were poking about in a kind of hell yourself this afternoon when I came along." Mr. Sprackling looked scared. "Whatever do he mean?" he gaped. "Weren't you healing or helling up potatoes?" smiled Kenneth. "Digging up the good earth to cover the tubers? Hell comes from an old English word meaning to cover. When the Bible describes warriors as going down to hell with their weapons of war, it is an allusion to their burial." Mr. Sprackling, being reminded about his potatoes, shifted about as if eager to get on with his job, and Kenneth, who could have gone into the matter further, refrained from doing so. Noticing the timberman's restlessness, he rose. "I'll be getting on, then. I hope your leg will soon be right," he said. "Thank ye, young man," said Mr. Sprackling, and as he stiffly resumed his digging, he muttered to himself, "Strange ways o' thinking he has, but I dunno." Beside the Brook, Chapter 14. A Serious Talk. The shepherd plodded along the orchard path to the cottage of Mr. and Mrs. Broom. The children were not in sight, but their father was busy around the beehives. Autumn had returned, and the creeper was red against the wall. The glow of nasturtiums and sunflowers against the fence added their touch of fire to the evening's gold. Boughs weighted with apples and pears brushed Teddy as he passed, and the plum tree was netted against the ravages of wasps. Mr. Broom's face and hands were netted also, for he was taking honey. There would now be more cloud than sun, so that any day the bees would start to suck their own sweets, if he did not remove their wealth and place sugar for them instead. The children were absent from the garden for a very good reason. Peggy, now grown into a tall and useful girl, was mother's valued assistant in nursing a new baby brother who had arrived in the summer holidays to everyone's delight. And John, who found it even a wrench to go to school and be away from baby Patrick, was also in close attendance, dangling a woolly ball he had made. Teddy carried carefully a home-made basket which evidently held something precious. Since last Christmas he had been a frequent visitor to the cottage, for he enjoyed the love and homeliness of the welcome he received there. Mr. and Mrs. Broom were interested, too, in his belief, not considering him odd, as others did. They also extended their welcome to Kenneth, who was always eager to discuss and explain the things nearest his heart. "Hello, Teddy!" called Mr. Broom, for he had adopted the children's method of addressing the family friend. "You don't mind waiting a few minutes, do you? I've nearly done. Don't come near. The bees get worried over strangers." Teddy sat down on the edge of the garden frame, where fat cucumbers lay about in green luxury like stranded whales. Mr. Broom closed the last hive. "Now look at this," he said, bringing up a heavy bowl of rich honeycomb. Beautifully sealed, the wax was laden. "Wonderful, wonderful," commented the old man. "The wisdom and industry of the bees is a marvel." "Do you see the various colours in the comb?" said Mr. Broom. "They show the different blossoms the bees have been working. This has been a good season for them. You must have a section or two, Teddy." "And I have at last got something free," said Teddy, indicating the basket. "I'm a wee bit tired of always receiving and never giving, so I brought along the first of my duck eggs." "Have they really begun to lay?" asked Mr. Broom, leading the way to the house. "Aye," replied Teddy. "I found the first egg last Wednesday in the brook, where the ducks go down to the water. It was not there in the morning, so she must have laid just before I got home. They're away all day." "Well, I'm glad," said Mr. Broom. "And have you had so many that you can afford to give them away so soon?" "That's no matter," replied the old man. "They've laid a lot between them since a week ago. I penned them in early, and there's been one in the run every day since." By this time they had entered the cottage. "Oh, good! Here's Teddy," said John. "Come and see baby Pat." "Yes, he's lovely," cried Peggy from father's armchair, where she was holding the little one. "He's a bonny wee thing," said the shepherd. "And what do you call him?" "Patrick, just Patrick," said John. "He's going to be christened on the 3rd Sunday in October." Teddy said nothing, but as Mrs. Broom entered the room at that moment, he offered his humble present. "Oh, Teddy, that is kind of you," said Mother, shaking his hand. "Are these your own duck eggs?" "Yes," he replied, "and I'm right glad to give you something you haven't got, to try and make up for the many kindnesses you do for me." "We don't want any recompensing," protested Mrs. Broom, "but we really and shall enjoy the eggs. Hen's eggs are not the same. Thank you very much." "Where were you last Thursday evening, Teddy?" asked John. "Peggy and I tried to find you, and we waited such a long time. In the end we went to the village." "Did you want anything special?" asked the old man. "It was only that the pig was being killed," whispered Peggy, leaning towards him confidentially, so that Mother, who was busy, did not hear. "And we didn't want to stay here, so we thought we'd spend the evening with you." Teddy smiled. "It's not often I go off in the evening," he said, "but last Thursday I had the most important appointment of my life." Mother heard the remark and could not hide her curiosity. "Really, Teddy? May we ask what it was?" she asked. "I went to be baptized," he replied simply. Peggy and John were interested too. They believed that was another name for christening, and they thought it queer that an old man like Teddy should undergo what was going to happen to their newborn baby shortly. Mr. Broom had by now entered the room, so that the shepherd had a full and attentive hearing from all the family as he explained. I felt that I was ready. I'm an old man, and for a long time I've considered that my time may be short. That's why I've been so busy reading and thinking. One must understand fully before embracing the things pertaining to the kingdom in the name of Jesus. Now it has pleased God that I should be prepared, and I applied for baptism." "Where?" asked Mr. Broom. Teddy mentioned a place and a sect that he had never heard of, and Mr. Broom made a mental note. The address was a town about 14 miles away. "I had to be interviewed," went on Teddy, "and I satisfied the brethren so that the baptism was arranged for last Thursday evening." Peggy and John were listening as eagerly as their parents. They had attended christenings round the font as part of the church Sunday school routine, and could not picture Teddy's baptism at all, so John asked, "What were you baptized in?" "I was plunged completely into a deep bath of water, John," replied the old man. "That is the only way Christ and his apostles commanded us to be baptized. Those who would belong to him must be buried in water, buried in baptism, even as he was buried. And when we rise from the waters, there is a symbolical resurrection." "But weren't you baptized as a child?" asked Mother. "No," replied Teddy. "I was christened, sprinkled with water by a parson, but now I see that meant nothing." Mr. and Mrs. Broom were plainly disturbed. "Then you don't believe in the baptism of infants?" asked the former. "Or christening," corrected Teddy. "Sprinkling water is not baptism. No, that is no use at all. There are two conditions of baptism. There must be belief and immersion in water. A mindless babe or even a child with an undeveloped mind cannot fill the first condition, and must wait till it reaches understanding." "It is singular that you should come along with these ideas just now," observed Mr. Broom. "My wife and I have arranged with Mr. Treadgold, the clergyman, that the baby should be christened the Sunday after next." "Well, there it is," said Teddy. "Think it over before you proceed. One cannot escape the truth. Is there any record of babies being sprinkled in the New Testament? No. Only grown men and women submitted to baptism. Read about it in the Acts of the Apostles. Jesus himself went down into the Jordan to be baptized around the age of 30. Philip baptized the Ethiopian by the roadside. They both went down into the water, which shows it was deep." "We shall certainly think it over," said Mother decidedly. "I'm very glad you came along tonight, Teddy." He would not stay to supper, thinking he had said enough for one evening. Later he would tell them of his being received into fellowship, and of the joy of mixing with those of his newly found faith. When the children had gone to bed, their parents had a serious talk. I can't help thinking there's a great deal of wisdom in all that old gentleman talks about, said Mr. Broom. He's consistent in everything, and if the Bible is the word of God, as all Christians admit, then it is only sensible for earnest people to find out what it says for themselves, never mind the parsons. Mrs. Broom agreed. The disturbing fact is that people blindly trust the parsons, and it seems that they are adrift somehow themselves. Is it possible that educated men, such as they are, can be mistaken? Well, replied Mr. Broom, whose Bible study had been neglected since boyhood, but who remembered a certain amount, Christ chose only artisans and fishermen and such for his helpers. He did not call the educated classes. I believe that in religious matters the simple heart is the most fitting for God's service. We ought to look into these matters, said Mrs. Broom. If we find that Teddy is right over baptism, we'll just have to pluck up courage and go and see Mr. Treadgold. The christening can be postponed or cancelled altogether. It won't be a very pleasant job, seeing that he christened Peggy and John, and we've always attended his church. We haven't attended very well, confessed Mr. Broom, only on special occasions, and I'm not sure now whether I'm sorry about it or not. Beside the Brook, Chapter 15, The Hunted Fox. The shepherd's hands shook as he tended the sheep. He could not stand the winter cold this year as well as the last, for a dampness usually hung in the flat river valley that ate into his bones. This December morning, however, was frosty and bright. The breath of the sheep rose like steam in the still air, and their bleating wavered over the countryside. Everything else was still, save for the distant shouting of men preparing for a day's sport of fox hunting. Teddy was not aware of the meeting of the hounds till, resting to eat his lunch of bread and cheese about 10:30, he caught sight of the red flashes of huntsmen's coats through the brown branches of trees. I hope they'll not come neither to disturb my bairns, thought he. Better far if Jupe would take his gun and shoot the fox if one has been worrying. Soon the baying of hounds mingled with other cries. A group of tamed forest ponies in the paddock tossed their heads and cantered to the nearest gate, whinnying, for the sound of hoofs reminded them of freedom. Young men on clumsy colts, men and women on elegant shining hunters, rallied to the meeting place, while folks pushed bicycles over the rough ground. And all this stir to track down the life of a wee cowering fox, mused Teddy. I wonder where he's hiding. In the big cover, maybe. No more was heard of the rally until the chase began. The master of hounds led the field through the farmyard, a long drove, and then across Pacific Ocean to the dark cover, followed by the baying hounds with noses to the ground, and a welter of riders and excited children. As I feared, said the shepherd, seeing the effect on the flock, which scattered bleating in fright, ran a distance, and then stopped, wagging their heads in bewilderment and shaking their ears in terror. The whole wood awoke with discordant cries. Pigeons left the trees in flocks. Rooks circled, cawing loudly in the sky. The woodpecker uttered a harsh cleek, cleek. Pheasants sought safety in the boughs from where they could not suppress their agitated coughing. Hares scuttered across the open fields, clearing ditches at a bound. Now and again the horn echoed through the trees to keep the pack together, for except in the tracks, the wood was so thick with fir and rhododendron that the range of sight was short. Mr. Jupe had directed the master of hounds to the likely neighbourhood of the fox. "I reckon there be more'n one up at Green End," he had said. The clamour died in the distance, and the shepherd's mind took another trend. He remembered other days when gentle deer had flashed across heathery tracks, with rolling eye and lolling tongues, pursued by hounds and men mad to kill. His heart had always been with the hunted. "Speer ye away to the burns, that the hounds may lose scent in the water," had been his wish. The words of the psalm came now to his mind, and he repeated it. "As the hart panteth after the water brooks, so panteth my soul after thee, O God." He found that psalm later in the day, and, seated on a log in the sunshine, read it through. "I believe," he meditated, "that this is also the cry of one seeking deliverance as well as refreshment. The hunted beast dare not pause to drink, but plunges into the waters to frustrate its pursuers. All thy waves and thy billows are gone over me," he read on. "Yes," thought the shepherd, "the distressed may flee from trouble and seem to be overwhelmed in sorrow of another sort. But God is good. He is a rock in the midst of the waters." He remembered the proud stag he had seen once plunge the loch, threshing its way to reach a rocky islet far from its tormentors. The psalm ends on a note of hope, he discovered. "Seek him, and you will find him," was the old man's comment, "and in time you will gain relief and sanctuary." The day being Saturday, he was free in the afternoon to do his many little jobs at the shieling. There was wood to be chopped and stacked in a dry place, the duck's pen to be filled with fresh hay, pots to be scoured, and blankets to be aired in the sun. When the December afternoon was closing in, John arrived with a basket of yellow apples, and offered to fetch Teddy's milk from the farm. "That will be a help to me, laddie," said the shepherd. "Even so, I shall only be just about finished when it is time to light the lamp." The boy had scarcely disappeared when the hunter's horn sounded at the end of the copse, and an outburst of shouting brought to mind the disturbance of the morning. "Surely they should be all the way home by now," said Teddy, going to the door and looking in the direction of the noise. At first he thought it was a brown dog rushing through the undergrowth on the other side of the brook. But when he saw the pointed nose, the black-tipped ears, and the bushy tail extended in flight, he recognized the poor hunted fox. The distraught animal, panting with exhaustion, turned suddenly toward the brook, attracted by the clearing in the bushes where the shieling stood. Down the bank it plunged without pausing, splashed into the water, up the other side, and cowered below the hut. In a moment Teddy was down the steps on his knees and feeling under the wheels. The fox was too exhausted to run further. It would move for nothing but the dogs, and perhaps not for them. The old man grabbed it by the hind legs, then felt a burning pain in his left forearm, and when he dragged the wretched creature out, found a wound in his arm, bleeding profusely. The fox in its terror had bitten its captor, and now glared at him with fiery, glowing eyes. "Dinna bite, your friend," said Teddy, seizing its body and thrusting it through the open door of the shieling, just as the first couple of hounds appeared. The shepherd's action had not occupied many seconds, and now he was up the steps himself, with the door closed to intruders. From the small window he saw the dogs run down the bank, heard them splash through the brook, and then lope around the hut. "They've lost the scent," he chuckled. After wandering to and fro with noses to the ground, the hounds splashed back and re-entered the wood. The hunter's horn was heard calling off the pursuit, and soon the baying and shouting died. John arrived at that moment with a milk can. "I hurried to see the hounds again," he said, "but I tried not to spill the milk." A few telltale drops trickled down the can. "You're a good lad, John," said the shepherd. "Thank ye." "Oh, what's the matter with your arm?" cried the boy. "It's bleeding." "Oh, nothing at all," said Teddy carelessly. "Would you like to see something?" "Oh, yes," exclaimed the lad. "Come up behind me, but don't get too near." John entered the hut on tiptoe with excitement. He could hear the noise of licking. It was dark inside, and Teddy held the lad back with one hand, while pointing under the bunk with the other. The licking stopped, and two glowing eyes directed their gaze towards the man and boy. "Whatever is it?" asked John. "It's the fox," said Teddy, "saved from the dogs." "Oh, I'm glad, cried John. "I love seeing the hut, but I didn't want the dogs to catch him." The beast still cowered with head cringing and watched Teddy light the little oil lamp. John was too excited to speak aloud. "Are you going to let it go, Teddy?" he whispered. "Aye, I'll let it go a wee while longer, and it'll be safe to send it off." The fox's rich brown fur shone in the dim lamplight, and an unpleasant odour filled the hut. Blood trickled from its ear and shoulder. "The poor beast has been torn by thorns in the chase," said the shepherd. "It looks as if you have too," said John. "Oh, never mind that," said Teddy. "I'll put iodine on it, and that will be all right." "Mr. Jupe will be sorry the fox has escaped," observed John. "Aye, maybe he will," replied the old man. "But he can put a shot in it at any time. It's a more merciful end than being torn to pieces by dogs." "Let me watch you set it free," pleaded the boy. "All right," said Teddy. "We'll clear out ourselves and give it the chance to be off." They went down the steps, and Teddy made sure that the duck pen was securely fastened. Then they waited, their eyes fixed on the open door of the shieling. Presently, against the background of lamplight, the outline of the fox appeared in the doorway. It peered furtively about, then, lowering its pointed nose to the steps, it ran down swiftly and noiselessly into the growing shadows. An uneasy quack issued from the duck pen. "Nothing for you to bother about," Teddy assured the ducks, as John ran off home. Beside the Brook, Chapter 16, Someone Seeks a Shepherd. A man paced up and down the railway platform of a country junction. From his bearing he appeared to be either tired or impatient. His thoughts seemed not to be concerned with present matters, for as he walked his eyes followed the horizon line with its gentle wooded hills, and lingered on it as he swung round carelessly on his heel when he could go no further. Nearly a year now I've been wandering in this country since I landed, and perhaps I am no nearer to finding him. But still there's hope. He stifled the fear that the father he had not seen for 25 years might be dead. No, I won't believe he's gone. Wherever I've traced him, I've been told that he was well and hearty, but like a will-o'-the-wisp he has always departed. I hope this is the last lap of the search. I've done everything I can think of. Let's see. It was 2 years ago that he was at Salisbury. I'll scour the farms everywhere south of that as I've done around other parts. I'm determined to find him. So rapt was he in thought that he did not notice the passing of the time, and when a general bustle and a shrill whistle amid a crescendo of hissing steam announced the arrival of his train, he gripped his case and ran for it. Before it glided out, he found himself opposite a big, prosperous-looking man, who was evidently a farmer, and not many minutes elapsed before they were engaged in conversation. "Country looks well," said John Gray, nodding his head towards the passing landscape where winter operations were in progress. Tractors were busy ploughing the brown slopes, and engines driving threshing machines in yards. Farming is improving in the old country. "What are you comparing it with?" asked the farmer bluntly. "Have you been abroad lately?" "I happen to have a sheep farm in Australia," said the other man. "I've been back here now almost a year and see a big difference. At least I really noticed the improvement in Scotland, but I had no experience of farming in England before I went away." "How long since you went away?" queried the farmer. "About 25 years. "That's a very long time." His companion shook his head. "You must have gone after the first Great War, and since then we've been through another." "Yes, I was only 18 when I set off," said John. He fell silent for a time. Regret for his own cruelty in leaving his dear parents secretly all those years ago rendered him sad. The loving face of his mother appeared before his mind's eye. He knew now that she had died. He had seen the spot where their cottage home had stood. Save for the unkept garden enclosure and a rose bush turned back to briar, no one would have guessed that a house had ever stood there, for the scattered bricks of the ruin were overgrown with weeds. He could have wept at the familiar sight of the countryside. "Youth is often thoughtless and often cruel," he mused. "But there, I meant to make good, though I didn't know it would take so long. And it was too long for my dear mother. I pray God it won't be too late for my dad if I find him." Standing by the tottering gate of the old home, he had understood why the letters he had sent during recent years had never been delivered. The farmer opposite spoke again. "So you're a sheep farmer? Ah, your country lends itself to that. Mine is mixed farming. I don't often leave the farm either, but I'm on business and I grudge this jaunt. Trains aren't in my line either. Rather get about in the car, only the big end went. What's the extent of your range?" "Roughly 6 square miles," replied John Gray. "Whoa!" exclaimed his companion. but I've had to work mighty hard, and I didn't go with the intention of sheep farming at all. And how's the farm being managed if you're taking a year off in the old country? Oh, I have reliable men, but even if I hadn't, I should have come all the same. What's the idea? Asked the farmer. I'm looking for my dad, said John. I left the country without letting the old folk know, and this is the first real chance I've had to get back, though I've tried to get in touch of late years. Any luck? No, none, so I came. The home in Scotland is gone. I found my mother's grave in the kirkyard, but my dad went south about 10 years ago, I learned from the folk. I've been from place to place following up clues, a disappointing quest. Folks confused him with one and the other. My dad apparently kept to himself, and in a little while he'll be off somewhere else. What was he doing wandering about like that? Asked the farmer. He used to be a shepherd, but he broke all the home ties and came to England as a drover. How far have you traced him? Asked his companion. I believe as far as Salisbury, said the other. I haunted the market there for a while and got talking with farmers and countrymen. One or two I spoke to remembered someone who answered to his description, but they didn't know his name. Said he might have got into the employment of a farmer living down the New Forest way. His companion became interested. I'm not so far away from those parts myself, he said, just over the Dorset border. I know a number of farmers living round there. Do you happen to have the names of any? A ray of hope shot through John's heart. I've collected such a lot of information, he replied. A deal of it useless, I fear. He produced a fat notebook from his wallet and looked up the latest entries. Robbins, Breamore, Farmer Coombs, Vermwood, Farmer Wilmot. His fellow traveller laid a hand on his arm. I know Farmer Wilmot, he said. He comes regularly to Salisbury Market. Saw him less than a month ago. And come to think of it, he slapped his thigh as though to reprove himself for not remembering before. He was only talking to me last time about a singular sort of old chap he had had for some time. A shepherd or something, invaluable with animals. I didn't take much notice at the time, and have forgotten about it since, till your talk reminded me. You're not just imagining this? Asked John. His hopes had so often been raised, only to be dashed down again when he had grown doubtful of trustworthy information. No, that's right, persisted the farmer. I'm sure of it now. And holding up the forefinger of his horny right hand, he emphasised his instruction. You go to Farmer Wilmot's place at Knutswood. Where are you bound for now? Blandford, replied John. Well, you do as I say, find Father Wilmot's place, and if you don't discover your old dad there, you'll find him somewhere round that way. The farmer seemed so confident of the advice that he offered that John could not help being impressed. If anything comes of this, I'll let you know, he promised. I feel that my search is nearly over. Yes, you tell me. Put down my address in your book. All. Joseph Hall. Hatch's Farm, Wimborne. That's me. The train stopped more frequently than before at the country stations, and John could scarcely contain his anxiety to get the journey over. He looked at his watch. It was too late to do anything today. Tomorrow he would set out for Knutswood. What was the day? February the 2nd. Would February the 3rd be the great day when he would find his dear old dad? The countryside was beautiful with its flat valleys between the hills. Floodwaters over the meadows hid the river channels, but promised fertility for next summer's hay. Now the train ran through pine woods, whose dark beauty was lit by the gold of the setting sun, and then into the open country again. "We'll soon be home now," said Farmer Hall, who pictured his own warm dining-room with logs blazing on the hearth, and his family gathered round. "I wonder if I'll find a home tomorrow," thought John wistfully. Beside the Brook, Chapter 17, Friends in Need. Mrs. Broom was busy making rabbit pie for dinner. The house was quiet, for Peggy and John were at school, and baby Patrick lay sleeping happily in his cot. She chopped the parsley, then went to the stove and stirred a small saucepan of beef tea. "That will soon be ready for him," she said to herself. "He ought to feel better after he's had it." He was Teddy, who was spending the 4th week of illness in the cottage bedroom overlooking the orchard. A bowl of snowdrops had spread their petals wide in the sunshine of his room, and a leafless spray of japonica studded with coral buds peeped over the sill. Teddy had been watching puffs of white cloud sailing across the blue sky. Many thoughts passed through his mind as weakly yet contentedly he lay in the little wooden bed. But his main feeling was one of gratitude to God for his goodness in providing loving friends in his hour of need. Frequently he dozed, to waken shortly and open his eyes in the sunshine flooding the room. It had been difficult for Mr. and Mrs. Broom to persuade the old shepherd to come to their home. Not until Christmas time had they learned of the injury to his arm, for Teddy had tended the bite himself until the limb grew stiff, and he had been compelled to visit the doctor, who promptly put it in a sling and forbade him to use it. Peggy had brought home the news one afternoon. "Mother," she said, "it's awfully awkward for Teddy to look after himself with his arm in a sling. Can we go and do jobs for him?" "Certainly, dear. But what's the matter with it?" "Run and tell him to come along here." Teddy came, but politely ignored Mother's inquiry as to the cause of the injury. "Oh, it's nothing. It'll soon get well," he assured her. Mrs. Broom was not so certain. She made appetizing soups and steamed puddings for him, did his washing, and sent the children regularly to bring reports of their old friend. But January found him growing more frail, and it was the worst time of the year, so that Mr. and Mrs. Broom were concerned about his welfare. "He could have the little room over the porch," said Mother. "He would make scarcely any extra work, and he's so good." "Well, if you can only prevail him to come till the worst of the winter is over, that would help him over this stage," said her husband. "But he'll go from bad to worse in that cheerless little hut, and perhaps die. How old is he?" "About 75. "Oh," said father, "it's a marvel he has ever been able to stick that life so long. They miss him on the farm." "I'm not surprised," said mother. "We'll do our best to persuade him to come. After all, it's nothing more than our Christian duty to tend the poor old soul, and the children will love to have him in the house." Teddy made a number of excuses to support his independence, but cold and stiffness entered the injured arm which refused to heal, and the dampness of winter gripped his frame. Unable to manage the work of his humble dwelling, he felt the discomfort and the trial of inaction. Feeding the ducks, whom winter had made hungrier than ever, was a burden, but still the old man did not grumble. "The Lord is good to me," he assured himself, and Kenneth, who was also anxious about the old shepherd's health. "I know the brethren will look after you, if you will allow me to tell them," said the young man. Teddy could not meet often with those of his faith, and winter conditions prevented those who paid him an occasional visit from seeing him during the worst months. But Teddy was firm. "Don't tell them," he said. "I won't be a burden to anyone. I've kind friends here. I'll be fine when the spring comes." Vainly Kenneth pointed out that rather than being a burden, tending him would be a privilege. "Perhaps I can come and live here with him," he planned. But, improving on the idea, he sought the advice of Mrs. Broom. "What can be done about our old friend?" he asked. "Could we get a room for him at the farmhouse or the dairyman's cottage?" "Is he any worse today?" asked Mrs. Broom quickly. "I fancy he is worse than he was 2 days ago," replied Kenneth. "He doesn't say much, and it's unlike him to be silent." "That settles it," said Mrs. Broom decidedly. "Whether he wants to or not, he's coming here. My husband and I have discussed it already, and it's only Teddy's independent spirit that has stopped him coming before he got as weak as this. I'll go round myself and see him." Kenneth accompanied her, and found the shepherd lying in his bunk with the brown blanket over him, and a small fire in the grate. "You are coming to us this very night," announced Mrs. Broom. "My husband and I are determined that you shall. I'll get your things ready now, and when I'm gone, father will come and fetch you." Teddy was preparing to protest. "It must be some queer notion of pride that makes you refuse," she said, collecting his necessities. She refrained from using the word stubbornness, though it was on the tip of her tongue. "Yours is a case where you have to swallow your pride, if I may say so, for your friend's peace of mind," said Kenneth. "It may be hard for you to give in, but it's the right thing to do. I'm convinced." "Then I'll come," said the old man feebly. "Maybe I'll be able to recompense you in some way when I'm better." "Forget about it, please," begged Mrs. Broom. "It's a pity if one can't show a little neighbourly kindness without this constant idea of paying back. Stay here, Kenneth, while I run home and get father." So Teddy had been transferred to the bright, cosy bedroom above the porch, where a fire burned to greet him and a warm, comfortable bed stood ready, with counterpane turned back to receive him. The children were thrilled at the coming of their guest, but mother stressed the fact that as Teddy was ill, they must not worry him with their attentions or noise. "We'll be as good and quiet as we were when Pat came," promised John. "What about the ducks?" asked his sister. "We've already arranged about them," said her mother. "As it is too dark and muddy in the mornings to go to see to them, Daddy is putting them in the old hen run along the wall, and they will be quite all right sleeping in the empty kennel with a board in front." Very soon Teddy was glad he had come. "I'll get better all the sooner noo, I hope," he said cheerfully. But the doctor was not so sure. The arm, however, began to mend. "It was caused by a fox biting him, you must know," said he to Mrs. Broom. "I'm satisfied with the progress of the wound, but his inability to move about normally during the damp weather has allowed the cold to settle in him. His lungs are not too fit." "I'll do my best to look after him as if he were one of my family," said Mother. "I know you will," smiled the doctor, shaking her hand warmly. Teddy was delighted to receive a visit one Sunday from two of the brethren, as he described them to his kind hosts. They spent the whole of the afternoon in his room, and another hour in the dining room with the family. Mr. Broom especially was interested in their conversation, which he recounted to his wife after the departure of their guests had left her free from the duties of hospitality. "There's a great deal of truth in what they believe," he said. "It surprises me that we've never heard a breath of it before." "A great deal of truth!" exclaimed Mother. "As far as I can see, it's all truth, and I'm going to make it my business to follow it right through. The goodness and patience of that dear old man upstairs have proved to me that he's animated by something true and worthwhile. I hope he'll be able to take a little rabbit pie," said Mother to herself on this day as she busied with her cooking. "I'll put a slice or two of bacon and some hard-boiled eggs in it to make it attractive." The old man was thinking about his sheep when she took up the tray. "Have ye heard how the flock is faring, Mrs. Broom?" he asked. "Now don't you worry about them," reproved Mother kindly. "You handled them long enough, and ably enough to show Father Wilmot and every one of his men how to go on with the job. That young farmhand, Leonard Gibson, has taken them on, and as far as I've heard, everything is all right." "It will soon be lambing season," he said. "To look at yon sky, you would think it was so already." "Yes, it's a wonderful day for early February," replied Mrs. Broom as she placed the hot dinner on a small bed table. "Now try and eat plenty of the vegetable and gravy," she coaxed, draping Father's dressing-gown around the old man's shoulders. Teddy did his best, which pleased Mrs. Broom when she came with a fruit plate of stewed pears and custard. "Eat this too," she said, "and then I shall know you'll be all right while I go to the village this afternoon. I have to get the groceries, but I shan't be more than an hour." When Peggy and John had returned to school and Father had gone back to work on his ground, Mrs. Broom dressed baby Pat in his snug woolly suit ready for going out, and then ran upstairs to see if the invalid was comfortable. "I'm leaving the door unlocked, Teddy," she said, "in case the doctor comes, and if you hear anyone in the kitchen, that will only be the baker." "That's fine," said Teddy with a smile. "You wait on me hand and foot. God bless you." Pat was a rosy-cheeked baby and enjoyed his pram rides to the full. At 6 months he had 4 teeth, which he tried out on a bone ring, a dangle with bells, and could sit up and greet every cat and dog he passed with a bubbling "Goo-goo." Mother dared not put anything that took his fancy within his reach, for he quickly pitched it out and clapped his hands. In this way she had lost one of her furry gloves, and a packet of tea while looking the other way. Had Pat's own gloves not been tied securely on, they would have disappeared also. Now he tugged at his hat strings till Mother put her finger up, saying, "Naughty boy, you mustn't do that." Pat switched his attention to a flock of rooks twisting in the sky, and held up his little hand to show Mother. "Yes, dear," she said. "Caw-caw, that's what the big birds say." Then Pat showed her something else. A tall horse looking over the hedge with long ears pricked up. "That's a horse," said Mother. Pat was too young to say anything but "Goo." His woolly paw flung out again, this time to point out a man rapidly overtaking his pram. Mrs. Broom heard the approaching footsteps, but did not turn. "Excuse me, madam," he said, raising his hat. "Am I in the right direction for Mr. Wilmot's farm?" "No," she replied, "but you haven't come far out of your way. Just turn back. These are the fields and those are the buildings. You can see the farmhouse roof, that grey one," she pointed out. "Thank you," said the stranger, turning and almost darting away. "Whoever does he remind me of?" mused Mrs. Broom. "I know someone with features like that and a similar voice, but I can't think who it is." Baby Pat suddenly seized his pram cover and rolled it up into a ball. "No, you don't," said his mother, tucking it tightly into the sides of the pram, and immediately she forgot the stranger.
Thank you for joining us. We hope you found the episode helpful. Don't forget, most of these episodes are also available as videos on our video channel, cdvideo.org. So head over and take a look. If you have any comments or questions or suggestions, please get in touch or leave us a voice message. We love to hear your feedback. You can email us at btf@cdvideo.org. If you enjoyed the episode, then please share it with others. Until next time, may God bless you in your studies and your walk towards God's kingdom. Amen.